I did another video where I talked about 5 strange religious beliefs, but this one will stand independently of the other. You don't have to watch them in any particular order. But here's a list of 3 more strange religious beliefs. Let's get into it. Here's the top strange religious belief I wanted to cover. It comes from Islam, so let me give a little background on some of the terminology, since lots of my audience is from a Christian background. The devil, as he's colloquially understood, wasn't really a part of Judaism originally. It took thousands of years for a devil or even demon-like figures to appear, which is why it's so funny to me when Christians say that Satan tempted Eve, when the Bible very clearly says it was a serpent, not Satan. Anyways, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written somewhere around the 5th or 6th century BCE. That's according to most biblical scholars, as far as I can tell. But honestly, it's genuinely really hard to tell. Anyways, the New Testament was written between 70 and 150 CE, and the Quran was written in the early 600s. So the Quran is newer than the Old Testament by a little bit, but both Islam and Christianity mostly accept the stories presented by the first 5 books of the Bible. As far as I can tell, most versions of Islam accept the first 5 books of the Bible, Psalms, and some of the Gospels from the New Testament, but they think it's been so degraded by this point that the original is pretty much lost. At any rate, Islam doesn't really have demons or Satan in the same way that Christianity has Satan and demons. Islam has something called jinn. Here's how jinn is defined: any of a class of spirits, lower than the angels, capable of appearing in human and animal forms and influencing humankind for either good or evil. Now, Muslims have some irrational fears about jinn. Apparently, they believe that sitting in certain ways will invite jinn in and allow them to possess you. They have some really interesting techniques to keep them out, like methods for entering and exiting a room, for example. But as far as I can tell, it's mostly just folklore more than actual doctrine, like Jehovah's Witnesses are with Smurfs. At any rate, here's something I found from a Muslim message board. Somebody asked the question, if a bathroom contains a toilet along with a shower and a sink, is it still offensive to make mention of God in it? If so, then does a curtain in between the toilet and the rest of the bathroom suffice as a separation that would make it permissible to make mention of God at the sink when washing your hands, for example? And here's the answer. It seems to this impoverished soul that mentioning God remains offensive in a bathroom that contains a sink and shower in addition to a toilet. There are 2 reasons for this. 1, it still holds true that the room as a whole was built in order to relieve oneself inside it, and it's offensive to mention God in any room that's built for this purpose. The fact that other things are added to the room doesn't cause it to cease being a place where one relieves oneself. 2, the wisdom behind the offensiveness of mentioning the name of God in a place where one relieves oneself is to prevent the name of God from being mentioned in a place that does not befit it, and the presence of a sink and shower in the room does not obviate this wisdom. It doesn't seem that separating the toilet from the other parts of the bathroom with a curtain would constitute sufficient separation for the sink and shower area to no longer be considered a place of relieving oneself. However, if the toilet area is separated by a door that is shut, then this would separate the 2 areas, and it would no longer be offensive to mention God's name when washing your hands. This is a really good example of overreaching or exaggerated importance placed on an event or idea. Is it really that important to not say a word in the bathroom? So important that you'll have a new wall and door added to the room so that you can say the word while you wash your hands. Honestly, this isn't out of the ordinary for Christians either. It seems way over the top, but Christian culture demands this kind of outrageous behavior too. I've said this before, but I don't blame Muslims for this kind of weird behavior. I just know that's part of human psychology. I hate to see people pulled into this kind of extremist mindset. Here's another post in the same forum, just a few posts down. Somebody said, "My mother is not a Muslim, but she believes that evil spirits occupy bathrooms, at least when those bathrooms are unclean. It's not hard to believe that jinn would be in bathrooms. If we believe that jinn are everywhere else, what difference does it make? Jinn like to tempt and mess around with us. There couldn't be a more perfect place for them to do that other than a bathroom. We have to guard our private parts because people do a lot of sinful things in bathrooms." It's just really bizarre folklore. But like I said, who am I to talk? At one point, I thought Jesus came back in 1914 and inspected the world's religions to pick out the right one, and it just so happened to be Jehovah's Witnesses. Which brings me to my next point on the list. Point number 2. God's going to start Armageddon. Any day now. Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses have this really strange belief about 1914, 1919, and lots of other really specific dates. The founder made a bunch of really specific predictions in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Jehovah's Witnesses had to come up with an explanation for the dates. They doubled and tripled down on them. So the founder predicted the world would end in 1914. Nothing happened, of course. So he said that instead of the world ending, what he really meant to say is that Jesus came back, invisibly, and he made a new prediction for the end of the world in 1919. He died on Halloween night in 1916, so he never got to see what happened after that. But of course, nothing did. So the new Jehovah's Witness leadership claimed that instead of the world ending, what he really meant to say is that Jesus perused the world's religions and picked out a particular one as his chosen representatives. And that just so happened to be Jehovah's Witnesses, or actually the Bible students at the time. They didn't change their name to Jehovah's Witnesses until the 30s. So anyways, here's where it gets really interesting. They made a long-term prediction after that. They said that before the generation who lived to see 1914 died off, Armageddon would come. They released books called Millions Now Living Will Never Die, stuff like that. They were serious about it. Well, they wanted to calculate out how long it would be before Armageddon came. So they took an example person, Fred Franz, who was baptized and anointed by 1913, and who eventually became one of the governing body members, and they said Armageddon will come before this guy dies. Well, guess what happened in 1992? This guy died. So now this prediction that they made part of their core doctrine fell flat. What do they do now? They redefine the word generation. This is called the second generation teaching, by the way. They expanded the time to include the lifespan of anybody who was baptized and anointed during the same time this guy was alive. So being generous, let's assume that somebody is anointed at like 20 years old. That just does not happen, by the way. Nobody gets anointed any earlier than like 25 or 30. But I'm being generous, so let's roll with it. Assuming a 20-year-old got anointed in 1992, the day before Fred Franz died, and let's assume the guy lives to be 80. That means they have an absolute max of like 30 years before they have to change the teaching again. So it's going to be interesting to see what they decide to do. This is a core piece of their beliefs. They can't really extend it anymore. We've had a few beliefs from different cults, and one from Islam. Now let's take a look at a weird belief from a really popular religion, Catholicism. Praying over a cup of wine literally turns it into blood. It's called transubstantiation, and it's largely a Catholic belief. It's one of those hills that Catholics have decided to die on. So I went in search of explanations for it. How do Catholics explain this? And I found these guys on a radio show explaining why they felt it's more rational to believe that the cracker and wine literally turn into the body and blood of Jesus when they pray over it. Let's give it a listen.
He says things that are really not the same as the other I am statements. He says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life. My flesh is food, my blood is drink. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I am him. He goes on and on. Like with the door, Jesus doesn't say, my hand is a handle and my shoulder blades are hinges. He who pushes me open. He doesn't go on and on in the same way, right?
So the argument he's giving is that Jesus said, I'm the door to heaven, or whatever it was, in a metaphorical sense, not in a literal sense. Let's continue and hear part 2 of his argument.
Okay, so I think that is a way that we can see there's a difference. And number 2, when Jesus says, I am the door, nobody freaks out over it. But in John chapter 6 and verse 60, after Jesus gives this whole discourse about how he's the bread that came down from heaven, they say, this is a hard saying. Many of his disciples, not the crowd, his disciples are saying, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? And Jesus doesn't say, well, it's just a metaphor. In fact, in John chapter 4, when Jesus was metaphorically talking about food, the apostles say to Jesus, hey, can we go get you food? He says, well, I have food you don't know of. And they say, oh, where'd you get lunch, Rabbi? He says, facepalm to the head. My food is to do the will of the one who sent me. So 2 chapters earlier, when Jesus uses a metaphor about food and is mistaken, he corrects people. But at the end of John chapter 6, what's so interesting, Zach, is that he doesn't correct them. He lets people walk away and abandon him over this, that this isn't metaphorical.
The person goes on to point out that it was a different language from a different time, and that you can't possibly understand the context of the events because it's been translated 16 billion times over 30 million years, and claiming any kind of nuance about the verses like that is completely outrageous. Then they say something to the effect of, oh, we're not getting into that right now. But I'll just say the Bible's translations are 99% accurate.
All right. Unfortunately, Zach, we're not going to be able to get into this at the length that we want to. That is a completely different subject. However, I have a book tentatively coming out here in spring, and I've written an article on this in Catholic Answers magazine on why you can trust the transmission of the Bible from ancient times till today. And what we have now is what they wrote then to over 99% accuracy. So
yeah, that's the clip. Anyways, it's outrageous to hear the arguments this dude presents. It's outrageous to think a cracker literally turns into muscle tissue. And it's outrageous to think that we have anything close to what was originally written down as the Bible. But people will find all kinds of interesting ways to twist things around until it makes sense to them. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Don't forget to check out my Teespring and my Patreon if you like what I do and you want to support my work. YouTube is always up and down for me, and it's been down for me lately. If you want to get early access to my videos, you can follow me on Facebook or support me on Patreon. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast where I talk about all kinds of interesting stuff. All links are in the description as always. Thanks for watching, guys.